Hello, everyone. It is Laurie and Jennie. And before we jump into our topic today, I want you to know if you watched our video, our most recent video of Aries season, if you did not enter our competition or our drawing rather for a free little reading from Jennie and I, go back, watch that, leave a comment with a suggestion, and you will be able to get into that drawing. We're going to give about, I'd say 3 days after this video comes out, and then we're going to shut that down and we're going to do the drawing. So now let's jump into our topic, which is the ingress of Neptune and Saturn into Aries. Jennie, why is this such a big deal?
Phew. It's a big deal because it's a big deal. These two planets do not conjoin very often. They're both slow movers, especially Neptune. Neptune takes a long time to go through all 12 zodiac signs.
What,
And so,
165 years, I think?
yes, it's somewhere, yeah, that's pretty much it. Saturn's a lot quicker. It moves through the whole wheel of the zodiac in about 30 years. So this intersection is not all that common. I mean, this isn't it's more than 30 years, but a little bit more than that when it happens. So, that's one reason. The other reason is because it's in Aries and it's happening at the very, very, very beginning of Aries, right at 0 degrees of Aries. The actual conjunction, that is a big deal number in astrology. Zero Aries the Aries point, so it's very public. So this conjunction is happening in a very public way again in Aries. And also, I would say neither planet is particularly comfortable in Aries. There's not an easy flow of energy between Aries and Neptune or between Aries and Saturn. It just doesn't, there's something big about that too. So I think that that's kind of the big deal.
It
Um, yeah.
it's definitely a big deal. You move from Pisces into Aries. That is from the last sign to the first sign. And that's, kind of the idea of the Aries point is the Aries point, which actually can be called the cardinal point because all the cardinal 0 degrees are impacted. But this 0 degrees of Aries is the strongest degree in the entire zodiac, in the entire chart. So it's a big deal. And Neptune is one of the outer planets that really has to do with the collective. It's not a terribly personal planet. Saturn is kind of one of those in-between planets. It's not real personal, but it's also not a collective planet. It's a social planet. So these really bring in themes of dissolving and building, right?
Yeah. And, so what's the big deal? We've kind of outlined some astrology facts here, but also just thinking collectively, this is a big deal because we're seeing things dissolve, which is very Neptune, and other things are going to need to be built. New things need to be built, which is Saturn. Neptune dissolves in a much more, much slower way because it's so slow moving. And Saturn is like, okay, well, we need to build. So it kind of brings those in on a cultural level and also on a personal level. And also the simple fact of Aries. Well, Aries ignites. Aries lights up. It's a fire sign, it's a cardinal fire sign. So there's a ton of energy in Aries anyway. And so that's what we're thinking dissolving, building, igniting, if you want to summarize neatly. So, you want to talk about Aries? You
Yeah,
ready for that? Or,
let's talk about Aries.
yeah.
Aries is the first sign of the zodiac. And when we think about Aries, we think of that, the burst, the ignition of fire, that, bang, fire just ignites. And, what else comes to mind for you around Aries?
Well, just taking it back a notch and just thinking about it as a fire sign, and it's the first fire sign, but fire signs are linked to things like myth. There's a lot of mythical kind of components. So the myth of the big story, the big hero story is something that you'll see with Aries. So there's that. And then there's like on a more personal, practical, spiritual level, fire is the self, the understanding of the self, like the deep internal spirit or spark that makes up you, your individual self. And then that deep spark needs to be expressed, on a bigger level. It needs to be expressed outwardly, as an individual. So it brings in that. I think as a spiritual practice, fire brings in the need to find your center. There is a need to center oneself. There's a need to understand, those hot, intense emotions and feelings, and figure out how to channel it, what to do with it. And I just want to note here, I think Aries does have to do with anger. But anger in itself is not bad. It's just that we need to figure out how to channel that anger constructively, because otherwise, Aries can be incredibly destructive. I mean, you can think about the power of a wildfire to just absolutely obliterate a landscape. So, that's one expression of Aries, the obliteration of I'm going to be selfish and do whatever the hell I want, screw everybody else, right? But if you can channel Aries and if you can figure out how to direct it, you can change the landscape of, what's happening in our society right now. I mean, it's incredibly powerful when it's directed. So there's a lot of question here about how to channel that. And on the personal level, again, it brings it back to that. How do I get centered? Where do I find that, in order to move forwards?
It
Those
really
are some.
brings in a lot about ego. I often think about images from Stephen Forrest's, how he talks about things. And I think it's in his first book, The Inner Sky. I always remember the image of a bunch of teenage boys getting in a car and hooting and hollering and, just this ego on display. And,
Yeah.
that's really the immature side of ego you see in the immature side of Aries you see in that young masculine ego expression. I also think of Aries as the screaming infant that demands what it wants and it wants it fast, and there's not any patience in that. Aries is hard energy, but when you need it, you want it. I often hear myself say, if you're in a dark alley and you hear somebody creepy coming up behind you, you want to be able to access Aries energy because Aries energy does not wait. It doesn't ask questions. It acts fast, it acts decisively. Oftentimes too decisively and too fast, but you've got to learn to manage that. And anyone listening to this that has a strong Aries component in their charts understands how that energy can get them in trouble and how that energy can support their ability to move forward as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, to add on to what you're saying, Lori, you can think of these things as a spectrum, and the big issue with Aries is, this sort of a lack of self-awareness, and then it turns into, it can be a real insecurity. That's the irony of fire, is there's so much bluster, and that you would never think that some of the most blustery people, it's actually a deep insecurity that underlies it. And so there's that insecurity that leads to the self-centeredness and the selfishness, which then leads to one to attack and blame, and just that constant. I do think about blame a lot with Aries, that need to make it someone else's fault,
Hmm.
without being willing to take on that self-reflection piece. And so I think that that's kind of that more difficult end of the spectrum. And as you work with that and you bring it into the more positive end, we're talking about courage, leadership, self-confidence, just real genuine self-confidence. Like, I know who I am and I'm stepping up to the plate right now in this moment. So I think I like to think of it in that spectrum.
Yeah, all the signs have, two sides, the
Yeah.
immature expression and the more mature expression. And I'm so glad you brought up that vulnerability because back to that little Stephen Forrest picture of those boys in the car racing up and down the street. Why is it that they are in that ego state of look at me, I'm so big and strong? It's because of their innate vulnerability, their doubt around
Yeah.
their own strength and ego.
Yeah, and their need to separate, right? That process, like I think Aries, as a reflection of its ruling planet, Mars, it does bring in that need to separate, to identify the individual, and to understand, like, your sense of self in the bigger picture. And it's funny because we can't touch on Aries without mentioning the preceding sign of Pisces because there's been so much emphasis on that Pisces Aries back and forth. We've had 2 retrogrades of Mercury and Venus going back and forth over the Pisces Aries sign line. And then we're going to have these big planets of Saturn and Neptune doing the same things in 2025 and into 2026. So there's a real message here about, Pisces is the end of the cycle, is the need for compassion, the understanding. I mean, let's put it in simple terms. Pisces is like when you're in the womb and you're still part of your mother and you haven't been born yet, and then once you cross that sign line and we're to Aries, now you're just born, you took your first breath, you're screaming, you're a separate entity. So that is a really easy way to understand what are we talking about. And so it's almost like this idea of like, oh, I'm born, oh shit, I didn't get everything I needed from the womb, I got to go back and there's some spiritual nourishment that I need, if you want to sort of take that comparison. That's almost what it's saying, like the birth process wasn't quite complete, so that's what we're doing. We're going back and forth into this collective understanding where we are all one. We really see that, and then coming back to, okay, now how do I incorporate that into my sense of self? What action do I personally need to take to meet the issue of the times? You know,
That's
so
fascinating. I'm so glad you brought up that visual of the birth because that really is, Aries is that screaming infant. It's like, "Ugh, here I am, I'm here, and I have come out of this
yeah.
collective space, yeah, the
And
womb."
I mean, I would argue that that 0 degree Aries is really the moment of birth. If you think about the birth of a new epoch, which is what we're actually going to be discussing today. So,
Birth of fire. That's, I mean, cardinal fire, Aries. It is the birth of fire. So
yeah.
here we are at a very, very important point. Okay, so what now, Jenny? What are we going to talk about next?
Well, let's talk about Neptune first. Like, that's our plan. We're going to talk about these separately and what they mean
And
in Aries and then how they come together and then individual impacts. So,
so
Neptune.
Neptune,
Yeah.
Neptune in Aries. Neptune has not been in Aries for a long time, but first, what is Neptune about? Neptune is the planet that dissolves things. Neptune brings in ideas of mysticism and we are all one. All those kind of ideas around spiritual openness are part of Neptune. Neptune also confuses and fogs things. I always think about that idea of the range of Neptune issues going, from these confused states up into these high mystical states and this
Mhm.
dissolving of ego, um, and issues of suffering too.
Yeah.
Issues of suffering in order to develop compassion for the whole.
Yeah.
Back to that whole idea of we are one.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. In a nutshell, right?
right.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the states of consciousness thing because I do think that that's really valuable to understand with Neptune. That Neptune, through the ages, is a symbol for the state of consciousness of, well, the planet, but humans on the planet. What states of consciousness are we in? And there's a lot, as you said, there's a big range. I mean, there's everything from just kind of like the sort of fog of like, I don't know, the nebulousness, through sort of like that kind of half waking, half dreaming fantasy state, like that state when you kind of wake up in the morning and you're still half in the dream world and half in reality. Like that's a Neptune state, and then and so on, like the meditation state, like the alpha state of the brain where you're both at maximum receptivity, but you're at rest, and you have to be in the parasympathetic nervous system in order to be in that. So there's, and then all the way up, the hallucinatory state, psychedelics is a really important issue with Neptune, because they all deal with states of consciousness. The idea of a higher self, that there's you, mundane you, and that somewhere there's a higher self that you need to connect to. That is also Neptune. So really coming all the way in, and the higher states are about really opening the heart, and to that sort of mystical transcendent, but really it all comes back to what you just said, like the idea of oneness, and so Neptune has a lot to say about how profoundly interconnected we are. on levels that we only partially understand. Like we're at a part, I think we're probably in our, we're either in toddlerhood or adolescence as a species. I can't quite decide which. Um, maybe adolescent because it's more self-destructive, but like we're in, we're just, that's where we kind of are, but we only so much understand the interconnectedness, but we are finding out more about it on a scientific level, on a spiritual level. I mean, just on, and on a, I think actually you brought this up to me, the somewhat unpleasant level of thinking about something like, well, geez, why does every member of the human race have plastic in their brain?
Hmm.
Because we're all interconnected. We're interconnected through water, and we're made up of at least 70% water. And it really speaks to all that. So those are some kind of Neptune ideas just to throw out to you and just give you a sense of what it might mean.
Yeah. And, before we go any further, one thing that I want to make sure to say is look at your own chart and see if you have any planets in those early first few degrees of Aries. Because if you do, this stuff is 10 times more relevant for you. So I just
Yeah.
wanted to say that. But, one thing that we want to think about is historical issues. When was the last time that Neptune was in Aries? You have
Mhm.
those dates right there?
Yeah. So get this, 1861 through 1875. So Civil War. That's the first thing of thinking about in American history, the sort of shattering of illusions of how far America had come since the revolution. And then, Neptune and Aries is a militaristic, viewpoint of that. So that was part of what was happening. Um, yeah, what else is going on at that time? There's some
Well, there
big
was a
things.
lot. Yeah. I mean, the
Yeah,
US was literally on fire. The Civil War erupted over slavery, all that, like you said, a brutal reality check. And radical social and political shifts, women's rights movements really gained traction, labor movement gained a lot of traction. And it was also a time of incredible rise, surging of spiritualism during
yeah.
that time. So, those issues, it's easy to look at this stuff and get really scared.
Hmm.
And I really don't want to ignite fear. We're all in that state anyway, to varying degrees. And it's not like bad things can't happen. Clearly, they can and will. But we need to have a really expansive understanding of time here. Astrology is a study of time. It's important to look back what was going on at that time. How is it reflected now? But we've been through a lot since then. It's not, these similar issues come to the table, but they will be resolved in different ways. Um, so there's a lot to think about
Hmm.
in all of this.
Yeah, and I just to kind of summarize, I think what you're getting at, Lori, is like one of the things that's interesting about that time frame of 1861 to 75 was like, yes, there was the end of slavery, and but then we had Reconstruction, and in which folks are completely disempowered again, and then more empowered. There's this flux. So that really is a Neptunian period because it shows you it wasn't cut and dried. Oh, it's over. Everything's great. There's no racism. Absolutely not. This is a much longer process. And that time period, that confusion around, okay, we've had emancipation, but wait, there's still these really like racist white people in charge over here. And then wait, this kind of back and forth. And then like, hey, you're going to get political power. Oh, just kidding. Like that kind of back and forth really is the having to swim through the complexity. So I just want to speak to like, Neptune does bring in that the complexity, like it is not cut and dry. It is not immediate. We'll get a little bit more about that when we talk about Saturn because Saturn adds a different flavor. But there's that. And I want to add one more thing, which is one of my favorite books that got written in that time period is Alice in Wonderland.
Oh,
Um, and which I know has a lot of levels of issues and whatever, but just thinking about the individual going into the rabbit hole and then all of the things that are part of that. So it's just an interesting
interesting.
thing to think about that.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah.
Huh.
So
That is very interesting, isn't it?
isn't it? It brings in a lot of stuff, but
Yeah, it does. And yeah, anyway.
yeah.
Um, okay, so what else about Neptune? Anything else we want to say about Neptune itself?
I mean, I think I'm not so much just trying to starting to think about what does Neptune mean in Aries, and what does that kind of bring in? And I will say that one of my keywords for that is the need for selflessness, the right action. There's something about Neptune, the dissolver, dissolving the boundaries of ego, dissolving the boundaries of self, and kind of unlocking that idea of, well, how does my role and my purpose fit with that much bigger picture, with that much bigger thing of oneness. So I think that that's one
Yeah.
piece.
I also want to, the other thing about Neptune that I don't know that we touched on is the issue of deception, which is an important thing to pay attention to too.
Yeah,
As our ego, as wherever Aries is in our chart, is pushing us into this state of dissolving our ego, we really need to pay attention to where we're deceiving ourselves, where we're being deceived, what can we trust? These are questions that we already see being highlighted so much, but it's going to be being highlighted in a very different way because with Neptune in Pisces, it was just a morass, and going
yeah,
into Aries, there's going to be more direct action involved in it. We're going to be being pulled down rabbit holes harder than ever. But over the course of time, as Saturn separates, and we'll get more into that, we're going to be able to build a much stronger resiliency to this stuff, I
yeah.
believe.
Yeah, and it's true. It's a good point because that is missing a whole piece of Neptune if you don't talk about deception. And you also don't talk about delusions, and there's a huge illusory piece with, Neptune. It is the planet of illusions, and of false beliefs. And then so therefore the collapsing of those illusions is something that we're seeing with Neptune and Aries. And just, I don't know, there's also like revelations that can be part of it. So I think you kind of get the message, but there's all these different kind of octaves and layers of what Neptune is, this nebulousness. It casts a fog, and sometimes it's the fog of transcendence that illuminates you and opens you up into a new way of being. And for other cases, it's this total buying in of of rhetoric, of other people's narratives, of believing that somebody can be a god or be the cult leader, right? I mean, it really brings that in. And in Aries, it's kind of a I mean, I see all the potential for the possibilities and goodness, and I also do see like Aries and Neptune. I mean, that's an intense mix. I mean, that really does bestow a godlikeness to somebody. And it's very easy to be misled and to feel scared. So if you're it's like this tricky, if you're driven by fear, so if you get pulled into your fear, it's this tricky balance and you follow that, you're going to get pulled into these darker paths, but at the same time, you have to recognize your fear, accept that you're afraid and open that as a vulnerability, and then that is actually what helps you blow up the illusion and move into something that is more like, I don't know, based in what I think is the true, which is that we all live on one planet together. It's you know that's a fact. It's not a
Yeah.
woo woo thing. It's a
I think
fact.
it is so important that we admit and face our vulnerabilities.
Mhm.
Because if we don't do that, then yeah, we're going to be very prone to falling down ugly rabbit holes and cults and all the rest of it. So we got to keep that in mind. So I think, yeah, who do you trust? Where do you let go of your own, dissolving your old identities? There's going to be a rise in chaotic leadership, even more than what we have seen so far. Um, Trusting your own understanding and doing your own work is the only thing we can do at this point in time, or what we need to be doing.
Yes.
Facing our
Yeah.
vulnerabilities, looking clearly at what's going on around us, and preparing for the building phase that will come after as Saturn begins to separate. So
Yeah.
that kind of covers Neptune, I think. And then we want to talk about Saturn. And Saturn is just about the opposite of Neptune. Neptune dissolves, Saturn builds and stabilizes, right? So Saturn has been moving through Pisces for approximately 2.5 to 3 years since the spring of 2023. And, when it first moved in there, Jenny and I talked a lot about its movement through Pisces as a time of building a structure within which to build or grow a dream, what we really wanted to create. And we have a clear view probably at this point, or we're going to have to go back and revisit it a little bit. But we've really done a lot of work to develop an understanding of our ideals, what our ideals are, what do we believe in, what is important as Saturn moves in there, as they both move in there. What ideals are worth fighting for? That's going to be a huge question for us. What is worth um, what is worth putting our assertive energy into?
Hmm.
So Saturn going into Aries, what's that? Saturn is not all that comfortable in Aries. Saturn is trying to structure our ability to take action.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, like you said, it's not all that comfortable, especially when you use ancient astrology and you realize that Saturn is in fall. It's sort of it's out of whack in Aries. It doesn't really want to be there. And I think some of that's about speed. Saturn is a slow-moving planet. It does not want to be hurried. It wants to be deliberate and methodical, and it wants to have a structure and a plan. Aries doesn't give a crap about that. Aries is like, oh, we're doing this right now. I don't need the rationale. Move forwards. Go, go, go. And I think that's the fundamental tension from my view, between the two pieces, like Saturn and Aries. But where they come together is they do both, like, I mean, Saturn's authority, but, Aries wants to be in charge. So you can easily see how those two come together. Now, the question that we all have to answer for ourselves is, well, if that's ego based and you want to be in charge because you think you're better than everyone else and that it's you get to do that, that's a problem, and it will show up as a problem because also Neptune will be in the mix, which is going to force some dissolution and so on. But anyway, that's the question. So it's more like, where do you open to the vulnerability, that Neptune brings in? And then Saturn is, asking that you do the work, that you hold yourself accountable, that you recognize that you're a self amidst a much bigger picture. It isn't just you and versus the world. So I think that that's a part of what it really brings in.
It's so funny because normally when I see Saturn moving into a new sign, the thoughts are, okay, this is an area of your life where you have to face reality and take responsibility. And yet with Neptune there, it's like dissolving it. So, it's going to take Saturn a while to get its ability to do what it needs to do because
Yeah.
Neptune is the slower of the two, which means Neptune is the stronger. Saturn's not going to be structuring Neptune. Neptune's going to be dissolving Saturn until sometime in 2026 when Saturn gets far enough away from Neptune that it starts really taking on its own authority. But you still have to be thinking about your own responsibility in this area of
Yeah.
your life when we get into the individual impacts. So the last time Saturn was in Aries was between 1996 and 1999. Everybody wants to think what was going on in your life. And we'll talk about this when we get to the individual impacts too. But start thinking about that now. What was going on in your life between 96 and 99? In what way were you facing reality or taking responsibility for your own ego, for your own desire to, yeah, be number one and plow forward in your life in some area, possibly in a very selfish way. I think of that for myself in 1990. Um, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the Saturn in Aries, it really does bring in the need to have discipline about your use of personal will. That's ultimately what we're talking about here is how do you, discipline yourself to you understand what you need and then really focus, channel that. Like that's something that's very important to be thinking about. And I just, yeah, it's interesting thinking back to those 30-year cycles. They're very informative to look at Saturn cycles, and that in and of itself is a fascinating study, even in understanding your own life. But anyway, I think do you want to move on now and talk about the two together?
Well, let's just touch on, is there anything you want to touch on as far as when Saturn moved into Aries last time, some of the important things that we might want to remember from that previous cycle?
Well, yes, actually, I think there's something that's very informative, which is the internet started in that
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
And so you think about Saturn and Aries, a brand new thing, and think about where we have come in all ways, good and bad, since the internet started. Like, look at the way our communication has changed. It also, part of the impact of that is it actually empowered these massive corporations to start to be where they are now, which is basically in control of everything, all the .com stuff and Amazon and Google and so on. So I mean, there's something about that. So you can see the negativity is it's given rise to these oligarchs and the dramatic differential in wealth. But at the same time, how nice is it that, I can send an email to my sister in Australia. I can text, we can video call, we can do all these things. So you can't look at one without the other. You have to look at that. I think my other favorite thing is the NASA and the space exploration, right? And the dropping of the Mars Pathfinder. That's pretty cool. So those are two of the things I'm really thinking about.
Clinton's impeachment
Oh
was
yeah.
in that time, which was, really the beginning of now every president's always, impeachment is always on everyone's thoughts all the time. It never was before that. Yeah, people didn't go there. But I think, you know, Clinton, showing that piece is kind of about the harsh judgment, Saturn's harsh judgments in Aries and leaders facing consequences. And
Oh
I,
yeah.
I hope we see some of that coming forward in this period of time. Some of the other cultural shifts that happened. Ellen DeGeneres came out on television. That was a big, big deal. Back before that, nobody, gay people kept their mouths shut and their faces down. And look at how far that's come. And yet here we are with this idea being confronted again.
Right.
But that brings up the themes of courage and self-identity.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Cultural shifts in
Yeah.
the identity. And here we are poised in another one where certain factors are trying to shove all that back into closet, so to speak. So, yes. And then what response will those of us who don't agree with shoving things back in the closet, what response will we have to that, dramatic trying to take away rights, and
And
that's definitely Saturn and Aries thing.
and both of those times, there were wars involved, Kosovo War, Congo War, Chechen War. There was a lot of that going on at that time as well. Um, so for both, if you combine the two, you come into, yeah, a lot global wars, also breakdown and reinvention of leadership in both of those periods of time. Lincoln assassinated in one and Clinton impeached in the other. There's just so many of these different connections.
Yeah, and I think, culturally speaking, it's like there's definitely on this authoritarianism really pushing, exerting force and trying to control the masses, but then there's also the push back, and I think the push back from the masses and remembering like, well, there's a lot more of people than there are of these leaders, and there's that push pull, which definitely is summarized in the Saturn Neptune fusion, of having those things together. And also, I think what's interesting about it too is in 2025, we're really experienced the push pull because both planets, move into Aries. By the way, Neptune moves into Aries on March 30th at 8 a.m. Eastern time, and then, 2 months later, we have Saturn moving into Aries on May 24th. They both do that. And then they both retrograde in July. In fact, Neptune, I think very interestingly, retrogrades on July 4th. I mean, I think it's a very interesting piece of American cultural identity here. So then they both go back, they go all the way back into Pisces, and then they station direct later on in this year. In November and December, and then they're both going to go back into Aries for the final time in 2026. In other words, 2025 is more chaotic. It's like, hey, we're moving forward. Oh, wait a minute. Nope. Actually, no, we're not. We got to go back to Pisces. And so, again, it's echoing that theme that we're seeing right now in this time period of March and into early April of Mercury and Venus doing that. So it brings a lot more kind of chaotic feeling to it of kind of like, whoa. So if you're feeling like probably everybody, like the ground is kind of dissolving beneath your feet, you're not quite sure what's happening, you feel confused, we feel uncertain, there's a lot of fear. These are all reflected in these two symbols together doing that kind of back and forth thing. And not that all that's going to go away in 2026, but there will be a clear, a much more, this is what's happening. Neptune's always going to bring in some kind of, is it? In Aries. So that is true. But I just want to point out that 2025 is chaotic. It's a pivot year. And so in a pivot, everything's sort of switching and pivoting. It's way more like, ooh, you don't know where you are. You're turning a corner, so you can't see behind you. You're not quite sure where you're going. So there's a lot of that feeling. And then, the stuff that, you're talking about, Laurie, like of, well, Neptune goes in there first. So Neptune's going to dissolve all this stuff. Then Saturn will come in and then it will move more quickly past Neptune and start kind of getting into the more of the building of the structure later in 2026. So even though there's some intense things ahead, there's no question, there's things that'll be dissolving and other things that will be needing to be built. I do think I think there will be some clarity in what that needs to be by then. Whereas right now, clarity is not that available right this moment.
And I think, it really is all of our responsibility to not live in fear.
Yeah.
In the worst of times, people continue to live their lives. People
Yeah.
continue to get up in the morning and do what they need to do, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of what parts of your life might be dissolving in front of your eyes. You still have the responsibility to live your life, do your work, love the people around you, support the people around you, and not let fear overtake you because that means somebody else won the game.
Yeah. And also, on a basic body level for each of us, when we give into fear and we cave into, oh my God, and you're just, you have that bleak view. It really shuts off your connection to the collective. It shuts you down. It shuts you down on a body level where your body is it's in the sympathetic nervous system. It is not where you want to live from. And so what Laurie, I think what you're talking about is the need for us all to contend with this so we can continue as best as we can to move the physical body and the nervous system into that parasympathetic place where you are able to feel the flow of love, where you are able to create beauty, where you are able to have hope, where you are able to connect with your purpose, which I think is really what Saturn and Aries brings in, your purpose about what will you personally do to confront the issues as you see them. What will you do to work on your ego and your fear and so that you can open. So you can't eradicate fear. You can't stamp it out or run away from it, but you can recognize it and, open and say, yeah, I see that. And no, there's other ways to be. No, thank you. I'm doing this, and constantly doing that dance and finding the things that help you do that. The different wellness things that you can do, the fitness things you can do, like how you connect with other people. But that's the key. More than anything else is the connecting with other people and
Yeah. Yeah.
connecting with community, which I always think we've made all these videos about Pluto and Aquarius, kind of brings that in. Pluto and Aquarius brings in that collective humanitarian piece too very firmly. So I think it's, where do you need to set boundaries? Where do you need to dissolve boundaries? What stand will you take? What core values of your heart will you act on? So,
What is what beliefs are worth fighting for?
mhm.
And these are huge, huge cycles. we
Yeah.
cannot see, we can just see these little pieces where we are, but these are big cycles. And when we give into fear, we're narrowing our perspective. When you
Yes.
understand that these are cycles that are connected to the past, the future, we just love each other and keep moving. That's all we can do. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay.
Where are we going from here?
Great question.
I
We've
think
got,
I think we should open things up, open up
yeah, let's open up some
I don't
charts.
want to spend a whole lot of time looking at the charts themselves, which I did prepare them. But I don't think we
Well,
need
let's look
to.
briefly at them.
Okay,
Let's just compare really quick
yeah.
what we need to think about in the more chaotic part of 2025 when they first go
Okay.
in.
So burning illusions and building new realities. That's really what is going on here. We're burning up our illusions, releasing stuff, and then preparing for building. And here we have Neptune enters Aries on March 30th, correct?
Yep.
And any of you who are geeky enough to want this information, take a screenshot here. Neptune, whoops, I don't need to do that. But 3:30, that's the date for that, correct?
Yeah, that's the date.
And then
Uh,
Saturn enters Aries. What's the date on that one?
it is on May 24th, though it's pretty late. It's 11:25 p.m. Eastern time. So for some of you, it's going to be on the 25th.
Okay. So in looking at those, what you can see is how many planets on 3:30, the end of this month, all these planets are still in Pisces. And here at the end, when Saturn enters, all of a sudden, nothing's in there except the North Node. That's quite a difference right there. We've moved into action.
Yeah, it's just, and you can see, I mean, you can just visually see, look at how all those, Pisces, everything's cleared out. Like you said, just whoop, that's it. So you can really just see this is a dramatic representation of the change in focus, and it is helpful to see it like that.
There's
So,
Neptune at 0 degrees and there's Saturn at 0 degrees. Okay, so
yeah,
I think, if you want a screenshot of that, grab it quick and we're going to move on. I think, are we ready? Are we
yeah,
ready to move into the individual impacts?
I think so.
Okay, here we go then. Here we are starting with those of you with Aries rising. Oh my goodness, this is a time for you, right? If you have Aries rising, that these two planets, as they enter Aries, are moving right into your first house. This is the most personal house. It is about you and how you show up in the world. Now, Neptune moves in there. What's it going to dissolve? It's going to dissolve your attachment to your ego. It's going to dissolve some way in which you have held your identity. That sounds pretty uncomfortable to me. So that's one thing you really want to think about that. What does that mean? What is this? I think of Neptune as bringing this kind of uh, chronic disappointment.
Mm,
Does that make sense to you, Jenny? Like there's something in how you have always expressed yourself that suddenly just isn't going to feel like it supports who you really want to be
mhm,
anymore. So there's a way of looking at yourself and realizing you don't fit in your own skin. That can be pretty uncomfortable. One of the really wonderful things about Saturn also moving in there is over the course of this period of time, as you allow, and with Neptune here, you can't fight against it. It's this part of your ego is going to be dissolved over this period of time. And yet, looking ahead, you can really understand that on the other side of this dissolving, there is a whole new identity that's going to come out of that, that's going to be created as you allow yourself to see the vulnerability that's underneath that bravado of your personality.
Mhm. Yeah, I think this really speaks to, on an individual level, when these planets are in Pisces or were in Pisces, you're having to do this like deep level of understanding some of your major issues that keep you out of balance in a lot of ways. The 12th house can refer to mental health, spiritual health. And so, in that, it's almost like you've been through this big process, and you're going to have to, once they move into Aries, you're going to have to look back and reflect on that process. And in 2025, you're going to be going back and forth and just really kind of say, you know what, I have to have trust that I did the work, that I'm doing the work. It's not perfect. I'm not done. But I need to move on into this place where I can now have agency and trust that I've done the healing work I've needed to do, and to stay in touch with Neptune moving in that too. I'm like, it's staying in touch with that vulnerability as a source of information, as a source of understanding, the bigger issues here, the bigger question about what's at stake, and then Aries coming in there too is allowing you to sort of take that vulnerability and learn how to use it to employ a deeper level of resilience. I mean, it's really this process of deepening you as an individual. And as an Aries rising person, you have a responsibility to be a leader in this world, one way or another. You are shining a light. So, no matter how difficult or painful that process is, the big takeaway here is that it's not just for you. It's you doing that work and being brave and bold and accepting that as your work and as your mission, is allowing you to be a role model, show other people how that they can do that, to just be this beacon of this blend of accepting your vulnerabilities and then the courage to move forward with that. So there's something in all of that. And Laurie, there's one other clue here, right? Like when we think about Saturn and where it was years ago, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, 1990, 96 through 99. What was the change in your personality over that period of time? Thinking about that, thinking about how you use that time to develop more maturity in your self-expression. At this time, you really are dissolving some part of your ego, some part of your personality in order to become who you are at your essence, who you need to become. There's also another little clue that I want to throw in here is that you have very likely been discovering a whole new powerful way of being in community that's going to really support this process. There's some way that community is supporting the changes that are happening in your personality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, let's move on to folks who have Taurus rising.
All right. So if you have Taurus rising, these two planets, Neptune and Saturn, when they go into Aries and they do that little dance back and forth from Aries to Pisces, are ultimately going to be landing in your 12th house. That's where you have Aries. So let's talk about that for a minute. The 12th house is always that one house that is the absolute hardest to describe, because it is the house that talks about transcendence and spirituality and, the need for retreat and isolation and meditation, like those things that you can't really easily explain, and that's just by nature of the 12th house. So if you have Taurus rising, it really suggests that this ability to get in touch with your deep core self presents in and of itself somewhat of a conundrum for you. Like there's you kind of have a hard time unearthing that. So that's what they're illuminating, is something about that process when they go into Aries. Now, the back and forth across Pisces to Aries, it implies that there is some kind of process around contemplating your vulnerability that has come up in community. There might be some grief, maybe some disappointment, perhaps some suffering that has come about in community, and also probably some, new things that have come to light that you're like, oh, okay. And so when these planets then move into Aries, it's time to kind of take those lessons that you've learned from that Pisces period, to take that and incorporate that into a deeper understanding of yourself, which ironically involves a further loosening of your attachment to your ego. So right when you're discovering who you are and getting more into your sense of self, it's like as soon as you discover that is the minute you also need to let it go. To like say, okay, that's great, and I'm doing this for collective purpose. But what I think was interesting as a Taurus rising person is that you've kind of had to do that dance a lot of your life anyway with Aries in your 12th house. Like this is not a very simple process. But once these two planets move in there, I think there's going to be some new ways in which you realize what things need to dissolve and what things you need to let go of, and then what new structures can you build that will allow you to step into this. I mean, for lack of a better phrase, like a compassionate warrior space. I mean, I think that that's important for those of you with Taurus rising, especially. But Laurie, what do you have to add to that
Yeah,
little
I like that. I like what you said about the compassionate warrior, the development of that. There's something within your unconscious or your understanding of your own psychological patterns, your understanding of spirituality. There's some understanding in that you may have been holding on to. And it is now has to be dissolved. There's some vulnerability in how you have held your own understanding of these internal hidden places that needs to dissolve in order to build something new on the other side of it. There's also the support coming from your your career or your social reputation. You know, Pluto moving into Aquarius is sextiling these planets as they come in. So that suggests that the process of releasing this piece of your ego is being supported by some big change that's happening in a very public way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your job is to let something go within your inner self in order to find what is real and valuable there.
Yeah, and some of your understanding is coming through whatever's showing up in your professional life or your social reputation. Like that's kind of showing you, what you're being called to do, I think, in some way. So it's interesting to add that piece. Another chunk of information is to think back to the last time that Saturn was in Aries, which was 1996 through 1999. So think back to that time period and reflect on what came about for you in that time. Like, what was the deal for you? Because that can really help you get a little understanding of like how this is the next, level up on the spiral for you. This is a 30-year cycle, these big lifelong cycles, and that can really give you a great deal of insight into, okay, where were you then and how does it relate to where you are now? And then when you add Neptune into the mix too, there really is this other level of what we've been talking about, the need to surrender, the attachment to the ego, like just to accept that you're sort of accepting the mantle of being this leader for the collective in a way that is selfless, that doesn't involve the selfish concerns, but is a selflessness instead.
I have always, when I've worked with clients and I see Saturn moving into somebody's 12th house, I always ask them if they have a therapist. And people are like, why? Am I all messed up? It's like, no, but while Saturn moves through that 12th house is such a powerful time to do inner work. It's such a powerful time. And, with Neptune in there as well, you do want to be careful about who you follow. If you have a therapist, you want to really, trust that person and make sure you're not being delusional about it. But it is a definite time where things have to dissolve in order to build a deeper understanding of yourself as a spiritual warrior, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, let's move on to folks who have Gemini rising. So this puts Aries and the movement of Saturn and Neptune into your 11th house. So the 11th house is community. In a nutshell, it's community. People get confused about exactly what that means. And it's not. your best friends, although there can be overlap with friends. Community in this regard really refers to like-minded people who support you to what's important to you. And it's also, community that supports you, that you are supported by. And so this is an area where you may hold a great deal of your ego identity here. With Aries in that house, you might really feel like your ego is identified by the community that supports you or communities that you're involved in. During this time, you've been through a lot of changes in your most social, career and reputation area. And now all of that work that you've done in that area is kind of coming together in a way in which your ego involved in community has to be dissolved. This can be a very painful place if your ego is really, really attached to a community involvement, and all of a sudden, this whatever occurs and this area of your life seems to dissolve. It can be a very painful thing. However, really understanding that on the other side of this dissolving, Saturn is going to be there to support a regrowth of community for you. So there may be, you may be faced with the fact that you've had certain illusions, delusions, whatever it is around your community. And now you have to burn that out in order to build a new reality for that community. What other support is coming in here, and what else do we want to think about?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, these are these long, slow processes. So another thing that is part of this whole picture, and again, this is many years. This is not just a simple, quick thing. But it's just the development of your wisdom, like the experiences you've had that have really opened up your mind and given you the capacity to think critically and to think globally, to think in terms of what is humanitarianism, like what is the collective need. It really just opens up that channel of, this is in a lot of ways the ninth, the 10th and 11th houses, and plus the ninth, if you're thinking about where Pluto and Aquarius is, these pretty impersonal houses. I mean, these are like at the top of the chart. These are where you meet, sort of your destiny, which is the much larger picture of whatever's available in the culture. I mean, you don't get to be in charge of those things. So there's something about your worldview, your mental space, really opening it up to a broader understanding that is supporting your wisdom in how you step into a new level of leadership in groups. I think it's interesting with the 11th house too, because I think one of the words that comes to mind where these planets are moving into Aries is something about teamwork here. There's
Hmm.
something about relinquishing the selfness of I did this and I accomplished that and I did this other thing, and really it's we are doing this, and and then the collective is asking me this, and how will I step up to be a we to, and that does involve some level of leadership, because Aries in the house of groups, you're going to be someone who has some leadership to offer because Aries has that leadership capacity. So all of that together is just really bringing this whole picture to life. There's some, your critical thinking, your professional or social reputation, and then you're stepping into a new level of leadership in groups. And it's all contingent on you reckoning with your own ego and letting that not be the main focus, but bring in a central focus of selflessness. So I think that's part of it. So
The
mhm.
only other thing to drop in here is to think about what was going on in regards to community in 96 through 99, because that was the last time Saturn was going through there. So what did you learn about being supported by community or being a leader in community? What did you learn at that time that you can reflect on that will help you in this process on the other side of the dissolving when you're doing the building? What can you reflect on from that time that will help you plan for the building stage.
Yeah, and I can't help but just add, like, it might not be something that's that pleasant. It might have been an experience of a removal from a community and having to rebuild the self from the bottom up. So, reflect on it. Very informative, even if it's difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not in the same place because, yeah, I
Right.
mean, Neptune's in there too. But there will be reflections of that time, most likely.
Yeah, like hopefully a new level of your evolution.
Yeah. 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 We're on a whole different level than we were in 96 to 99. So
Absolutely.
let's move on to folks who have, whoops, Cancer rising.
Right. So if you have Cancer rising, in a nutshell, this is lighting up your 10th house. Once Neptune and Saturn go into Aries, they are moving into your 10th house, according to the whole sign house system. So really, that is bringing up everything about your most public persona, your most public face. For many of us, that's the profession because or the workplace, because that's where you're interacting with the public one way or another. Or that might also be a place where you are making some kind of social contribution. Not for everybody, that also brings in just how you show up in public in general, like, period, whatever that is. So that's what is being illuminated. And you are being asked at this time to relinquish you know,
Hmm.
uh, the ego that's attached to the profession, to relinquish the identity that comes from whatever it is that you do in public. There's this, I mean, I think especially in our culture, there's such pressure to, what do you do for work? And that's your ego, your identity, and so this is a time of having to relinquish some part of your identity, seeing yourself as more than just the way you show up in the public eye, I think is a big part of this. Some of that is difficult. It's having to maybe have some grief, maybe accept a place where you feel very, very vulnerable, like maybe you're not quite sure who you are without your work. I mean, that wouldn't be the first time I've heard that. So there's some question about those things. But ultimately, this is for your growth. This is your opportunity, your time to step into a new level of how you handle this. But that new level absolutely requires this process of dealing with your vulnerability, bringing that into it, looking at it, and asking what is needed of you right now. What does the collective need of you? Like, what can you offer to all of these changes? Like, how can you step up into a new, really leadership role through that workspace or through that public place? I mean, that's a lot of what's being demanded of you. What stand will you take? What boundaries do you need to dissolve inside yourself at this time in order to set new boundaries that will set a new course for your life in the years to come? Yeah. What do you have to add to that picture, Lori?
Not a whole lot, but yeah, I mean, it's really is about letting go of some part of your ego that's attached to your career or your social reputation in order to create who you are really meant to be. There's a lot of support here coming from this new understanding that you are really building around how to navigate your boundaries in relationships. That's a really supportive piece that Pluto is offering from your eighth house. And there's also, it's could also be very interesting for you to think about what was going on regarding your career or social reputation between 1996 and 1999, because there'll be some reflection that's similar. At that time, Saturn was also going through your 10th house. So there's a similarity. There's a piece, at this point, Neptune is there as well. So there's a dissolving, but on the other side of this dissolving, there will be a stabilization and a building of who you are in the public eye. Um, is there anything from that period of time on a personal level that would be useful to mention, Jenny? I don't mean to
Yeah,
put you
for
on the
sure.
spot, but
Well, it's interesting because I'm actually reflecting on the idea of just being a much younger person back then. a way in which I actually turned away from something that felt really challenging, and turning away from something rather than sort of going, hey, what new thing do I want to create? And I really wish I'd had astrology in my life back then, because it is an interesting process. But at the same time, while I can feel a palpable, maybe even a sense of regret in some ways, I also see how that casts the die for me to be here now, doing astrology work. I don't, if I had made a different choice at that juncture, it's so obvious to me that this is not where I would be. And in some ways there's some regret tied up in that, right? But in other ways, I'm immensely grateful for, whatever that process was. And then also, so there's that. And then the second piece is, okay, well, if there's things that I didn't like about what I did that first time 30 years ago, what can I do differently now? Like, how can I step into a new level now that is in a way that is not perhaps caving to maybe some fear or whatever? That is a way of recognizing the fear and going, yep, that's there. And I'm making this choice anyway. I mean, I think that's what it brings up for me. It's pretty clear.
that
So,
that courage of Aries, facing that fear and doing the actions. And I mean, that's the thing about being able to look at the cycles, to look back, what was going on 1996 to 99. And I love that you said what was occurring there cast the die for where you are now. And I just love that you said it that way, because that's exactly how it feels to me too. It's like, oh, I remember exactly what this was, and I
yeah,
can see how that story is now bringing a very different level of a similar story, but you know,
yeah,
having progressed forward so far. I think that's really beautiful. So, ready to move on?
yeah. Let's move on.
Okay. So, for those of you who have Leo rising, this movement of Neptune and Saturn into Aries is bringing this powerful, powerful changing situation dynamic into your ninth house. The ninth house is, uh, I think of it first and foremost as our worldview and all the things that kind of come together to create we how we see the world on this bigger plane. You know, people talk about the ninth house as the house of travel and education, politics, travel, I already said, other cultures, even religion, not spirituality, but all these big ideas that come together and create a worldview. So this area, for those of you with Leo rising, you've got a lot of ego attachment to what your worldview is, how you understand the world. Well, this is a place where there's going to be big changes coming as these planets move in here. There's a way in which you're going to really have to let go of some way that your ego is very attached to that worldview in order to ultimately build and create a more realistic, mature view of the outside world. I can see how this could really, work in a lot of people's lives right now. There's so many ways that we are pitted against each other in relation to what our worldview is. And, Leo rising, there's such a ego there that, having to question and dissolve your worldview could be a very, very painful and challenging thing to do.
Mm,
Um, Allowing it is really the only way to go. Um, there's there's a lot of support here from people that you are in intimate relationships with. A lot of the big changes in your partnerships or people that have come into your life are here to support this process. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. What do you
mhm.
want to add here, Jenny?
Well, my eye is just kind of caught by the whole, being a Leo rising and, the heat and the fire and the bluster. And then here's my opinion and it's Aries, so it's right. and I just kind of just gonna get thrown out. But then the Pisces in the eighth house. So, this tenderness, this ability to like
Mm.
hold space for the vulnerability of others, like to bring that Piscean, the ultimate opposite of having this firebrand preacher like opinion, that you're shouting out. Like, so bringing together those two, the juxtaposition of that, like the knowing that, wow, you are a person who can bring that real compassion and tenderness into the really difficult spaces of other people's issues, letting that, it's almost like you want the boundary between the eighth and the ninth house to dissolve a little bit. Like, let Neptune dissolve it a little bit, because then it brings the compassion into the worldview, and that surrendering of ego attachments that Laurie was mentioning. It's almost like a literal, hey, Neptune, dissolve that boundary so that you can bring that compassion more easily at your fingertips, as you think critically, as you could become a thought leader with this, this capacity for that. But best if you've only done that necessary, very difficult work of dealing with the letting go of ego stuff. So I think that's part of it. Yeah, and I like that idea of the support of the partnerships, like that there's a strong support for you here that's very empowering. um and then also, Lori and I have been talking a lot about just like bringing this idea back of like, well, what was going on 30 years ago? What was happening the last time between 1996ish and 99, when Saturn was in Aries last time? What was that experience like for you? What happened to your worldview? What happened to your critical thinking? Was there something educational that was going on? Was there a teacher that a particular teacher you learned from? Were there travel experiences? All those things that Lori's already mentioned. But reflect on that. What went on in that time period? Because that's in essence like the kind of lower octave of where you are now. If you think of, I like to think of life like the Guggenheim Museum that spirals up. So one spiral 30 years ago you were somewhere. Now you've gone around a whole big block in that 30-year period. So how does that relate to this story? What did you learn at that time, and what does that bring in for you?
Yeah, that's a really important thing to think about. And I love how you said in the last one, whatever was going on during that time, cast a die for where you are now. And this is a very different time because Neptune's involved as well. But on the other side of the Neptune dissolving, you're going to be doing some of the same work of building and stabilizing your understanding of the greater world, of cultural issues, big world
Mhm.
issues and ideas. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
let's move on to folks who have Virgo rising.
Oh yes. Okay. So those of you who have Virgo rising, this big switch when Neptune and Saturn go into Aries is happening for you in your eighth house. The eighth house in a lot of ways is one of my favorites to talk about and deal with. It's really there's a little bit of the occult, wrapped up into the eighth house. There's a little bit of like kind of mysteriousness. Maybe there's some kind of secrets going on here. And the reason for that is because the eighth house is that place where you are trying to figure out how on earth to share resources with other people. And having Aries here really suggests that like you don't really want to. Like, you just don't, you're kind of like, yeah, maybe a little bit. you know but this is not the easiest place in a lot of ways to have Aries, because there is such a need with Aries to be clear about the self, and I'm doing this and I'm going to be independent and autonomous, and like I don't need other people. But the lesson of having Aries in the eighth house is like, actually you do. So there's this idea of like, how do you work with that? How do you look at who you are as a self? What ego attachments must you release at this time with Saturn and Neptune going in here? I mean, there's just this insistence that you release the attachment to, oh, I'm away, I handle people this way, or I'm only going to let this relationship go to here, or, those sorts of topics. There's a need to release that and maybe say, I actually don't know. I mean, that's pretty empowering for courageous for an Aries person in the eighth house to say, I'm not really sure. I don't know how I'm going to handle this, and really saying, I don't know, but I'm going to figure it out. And I'm going to have a sense of trust because I've learned a lot about compassion. in the last few years with these planets being in Pisces. So it's like, how do you bring that compassion forwards and bring with it the sense of trust of your own vulnerability, and that you're going to be able to do that and still be in touch with the Aries parts of yourself. It's not a loss of self. That's just what it might feel like, but it's actually an opportunity to have a new self in how you relate to other people. So it's, not easy, probably incredibly triggering in some ways, but it absolutely an empowering and necessary process that's happening here. So, yeah, so I will digress to
Yeah.
Laurie here.
It's interesting to think about that eighth house. Yeah, I mean, your ego is very wrapped up in how you navigate other people's deep, intense issues. You think you know how to do it. And it's a place where, yeah, like you've been saying, I don't know if I'm adding anything here, but there is a need to dissolve your ego here. There is a need to really, you get out of your own way. It's like there is something that is just really heightening that. And, you're really being supported. Those of you with Virgo rising, there's some big change that has happened relatively recently around your lifestyle choices, how you go about self-care, possibly health issues that you've encountered. There's some way in which that change is allowing you or is supporting you to let go of your ego in this area. And on a personal level, that makes sense to me. Absolutely, that makes sense to me. The physical issues that I have faced in the recent year or so is really supporting my kind of letting go of my ego attachment to how I know best when it comes to these deep levels of relationships. It's kind of interesting. And, the other thing that we want to bring in is the cycle. Saturn was in this same position in 1996 through 1999. And at that time, there were ways in which you were trying to stabilize or do some work and understand how to go into these deep places with other people. Well, you're in a different cycle now. Whatever you did back then, I'm speaking totally for myself, was very immature. So, as Saturn separates from Neptune after this area has been dissolved and you've had to face your vulnerability here, you will be able to develop this area in reflection to what happened in 1996 to 99, but from a much more mature position.
Yeah, I think the irony is, as we're going through all these, and what I think about, especially with this one, is it's almost like, your vulnerability is your resilience. As you work through, because Neptune vulnerability, Saturn resilience. I mean, that's what we're doing here. Is just really working with that. So
Absolutely. That's fascinating. Okay, now we're going to move on to folks who have Libra rising. Oh, people with Libra rising, this is a very, very big deal because both of these planets, as they enter Aries, are stepping into your seventh house. Seventh house is the area of our most intimate partnerships. I think of the seventh house as contractual relationships. It's not just our marriage partner or our spouse. um, it's also business partners, other contractual relationships, a therapist, an astrologer, whoever you have a contract with. If you hire somebody to build a garage on your house, that is a seventh house relationship as well. So you want to keep that in mind. I used to get so confused. I remember early on in consulting with people, having people who some big planet would move into their seventh house and I'd expect it to show up in their marriage and it wouldn't at all. It doesn't always. It can show up in other relationships. At any rate, with Libra rising, you have Aries in that seventh house, which would suggest to me that there's an awfully lot of your ego is very involved in who you are in relationship with. And there's some way with this Neptune moving in there and Saturn that some part of your ego involvement in relationship has to dissolve in order for you to create what is really most true for you in partnership.
Mhm.
So that's kind of in a nutshell how I would look at this. Um, over first of all, as Neptune moves in there, there's the dissolving. And this obviously could be very challenging and very difficult. And yet, really understanding that on the other side of the dissolving, there is the building back of a new reality. There's the burning of the illusions to begin with, and then the building of something new. There's also some way in which a relatively recent development in your creativity or in your love relationships or children relationships, there's some shift that has happened there that's going to really be supporting this process of change in your relationships.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting thinking about this one. You started out by saying this is a really big deal, and because it's going from, the lower hemisphere of your chart to the upper hemisphere, which by definition is going from a very personal, internal type of process in a lot of ways, and then forcing that up and out into the public, and how you interact with everybody around you. And it just, seems like, you have perhaps a specific idea with Aries in the seventh house of how you're going to be in that relationship, that you're going to really maintain this sense of individualism, while also being in partnership. And it really kind of gets at that fundamental struggle every one of us has, which is, the struggle between me alone and me with someone else, and this struggle between the self and then togetherness. So it really kind of gets at that. And I think with Libra rising, what it's really getting at that razor's edge of, letting go of the self, letting go of the ego, letting go of the I need to be like this in relationship, yet asserting oneself in an individualistic way. Sorry, that was hard to say. With Saturn there, so there's this razor's edge of not being selfish, not being, me, and forget about the other person, yet also not completely losing the self in the partnership. So I mean, I think that this is a very worthy pursuit, and very challenging to really walk that fine line, because I think there could be a tendency, like you said, Laurie, in the beginning. I mean, to believe, oh, well, that's it. This relationship's over, or I'm going to completely surrender this relationship. And that's really not the message. That there's a more internal message to this. And part of it is, the reflective process you've been in when these planets were in Pisces, of dealing with your lifestyle and your routines and your practices that help you maintain your sense of self. Is, you've been through that process, and now you're just kind of having to look at, okay, what resources have been uncovered during that process that I didn't know I had, that maybe aren't very easy to look at. And then now I've looked at them and their vulnerabilities. How do I fold that into my forward direction, and really let them be resilience in my relationship, where I make space for the other person, where I don't freak out about losing the sense of self. There's something in all those themes that's coming to mind. And I agree, like the idea that Pluto moved into Aquarius a couple years ago and is actually in support of this transition really says a lot about, well, part of the maintaining the sense of self is about losing yourself in a creative process, about, opening up your heart to just unconditionally give of yourself without worrying that that's some sort of giveaway and that you're screwing yourself by doing that. It's the opposite. But I like to think of the idea of a creative pursuit, some way that you just express yourself, whether it's dance or art or, skydiving or whatever the hell it is, but letting that be the place where you feel the empowerment of the personal self-expression, so that you don't kind of unleash that on the relationship, but that you're actually available in the relationship. There's something about that for
Yeah,
me.
and allowing that creativity, that creativity to support this change that has to happen for you in a relationship or in how you view yourself as a partner. There's something that some ego involvement in a relationship that has to be released. You want to also think back, to with the Saturn cycle to what was going on regarding relationship itself between 1990, what is it, 96 and 99.
Yeah.
Was the last time Saturn was moving through that seventh house. And there's some way in which something that occurred during that time, some development, some way in which you were, really working hard to understand yourself, to develop responsibility in relationship. Some die was cast then. I love it that you said it that way earlier, Jenny. But there was a die cast during that period of time that is now coming back around, a very different perspective, a very different time, but there's a reflection from that time. What you learned during that time is also a part of the relationship story that you can release now in some way to develop a deeper level of responsibility and maturity in how you work with yourself in partnerships.
Hmm. Yeah. It's sort of like be tender, be fierce.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, very good. I like that. We'll end on that and we'll go on to folks who have Scorpio rising.
Okay, so those of you with Scorpio rising, you have Aries in your sixth house. So when Neptune and Saturn go into Aries in 2025 and through 2026, that's what it's really lighting up is the sixth house, which the sixth house is kind of like the all the parts and pieces, all the things that you do with your on your daily basis that end up making up your lifestyle. So this is all the things you do, like brush your teeth, eat, your habits around how you eat and how you sleep, and ultimately how you care for yourself is what is showing up here. And I always think as a Scorpio rising person and having all that heat in the sixth house, there needs to be some kind of relationship with fire on a daily basis, whether that is doing something sweaty, where you run or you do something vigorous, or whether that's as simple as lighting a candle in the morning as you do your morning meditation, or whatever it is you like to do. Or maybe it's maybe you have an affinity for hot peppers in your food. So just think about how that heat shows up, because during this time, it's going to be very important that you, I think, look at perhaps the ego attachments that have to do with your lifestyle. Maybe you are a very active person and you're very attached to the idea of this is who I am. I'm a very active person, is an example, but that is exactly what may need to be released. Like this idea of that you are deeply attached to your lifestyle and you're attached to it in an ego sense and you need it in order to feel like yourself. Well, it's time to let that go. It's time to surrender to the idea that not everything might be as you thought here. And it's a time to really, yeah, just look at that and let something dissolve. There's some boundary or other that Neptune is coming in to dissolve and say, actually, it's not what you thought. And then Saturn is coming in with a follow up is like, well, there's something new for you to do here. There's something new for you to construct. There's something new, a new way to consider your sense of self. And it has to do with your willingness to look at your vulnerability. Whatever that is, the places where you feel doubting and you feel weak and you feel uncertain and you don't know, and just kind of look at that in the face. And, of all the rising signs, like Scorpio knows how to look at that in the face. So use that to do that, because that's what you need to do is look at that and then release the vulnerability and see it for the resilience that it actually really is. One thing that comes to mind here is, for example, if you've had some kind of diagnosis or some sort of physical illness that has come about, this may provide you with an opportunity to surrender to what you cannot control and see the resilience and the courage that's available in facing something like that. So I just wanted to, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen to you, but it's an example of how to work with this material. So yeah.
It's definitely a really important time for you to be really thinking about what are your routines, what is your health care, what's the condition of your health. Um, because yeah, you've got some ego attachment to maybe you being a strong, powerful person. There's some way in which that idea of yourself has to be released in order to create who you are becoming.
Mm,
This might be a very difficult process. It depends on a lot of other things and how this interacts with the rest of your chart. But there's definitely something in those routines in your day-to-day lifestyle that is going to change in a very profound way. You want to also think about the changes that have come about for you since the spring of 2023. There's been bubbling huge changes around your home, your family, your understanding of ancestry, whatever that might be. That big change is supporting you in releasing your ego, facing your vulnerability around your health or day-to-day routines. Um,
yeah.
the, the only other piece that we want to bring in here is Saturn's cycle. Saturn was in this same area going through this house for you, your sixth house, between 1996 and 1999. What were the realities you were facing and the efforts that you were putting in to stabilize your routines, your lifestyle? How did that um, set a die, cast a die that is now re-engaged to look at in a new way from a very different perspective? There will be echoes from that period of time. So think about that. Contemplate what was going on then. What were you building? What were you structuring in your lifestyle? And how does that relate to where you are now? This could be a challenging time for a period of time. And then as we get into 2026 and Saturn gets some distance from Neptune, you'll be able to really put in the effort and the work to stabilize that area.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, as a Scorpio rising person, you have a lot to offer in the way of compassion for others. Like you have a very giving capacity for that, and you've had to do some work in that area, and that is going to really support you as well, like that, understanding what that is and trusting that. So I forgot to mention that when I was talking in the beginning. So, all right.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to folks who have Sagittarius rising. If you have Sagittarius rising, the movement of Saturn, Neptune and Saturn into Aries is bringing these two into your fifth house. This is pretty interesting. You think about the fifth house is the area that we think of as creativity, as how we give of ourselves. People think of the fifth house as children, love affairs, where we take risks, where we play. But it's really where we most authentically give of ourselves. If you've got Sagittarius rising, your understanding, your own creativity is really wrapped up with your ego in some way. You really, have a lot of um, strength and yeah, energy to put forth into that area of creativity. With Neptune moving in there, there's some way that your creativity is needs to dissolve, or your ego around your creativity needs to dissolve. There's something that you need to let go of. There's some way in which your creativity, or whatever that fifth house of all those things I talked about, whatever is there that seems to uphold your ego, you really are going to need to look below the surface and into what the vulnerability under your ego there is. There's some dissolving of the ego looking at the vulnerability that is ultimately going to support Saturn in its process of rebuilding this area as it pulls away from Neptune through 2026 and really does the rebuilding part of this cycle, of this process.
Yeah, I think another I think as what's coming to mind for me too is with Neptune moving into your fifth house, it's almost like this
Oh,
elevating your ability to love other people to a new level, like to like sort of recognizing the importance of love. And I know it might sound cliche, but it's absolutely spot on. And so elevating that ability to give of oneself unconditionally and making that into it's like a spiritual, it elevates it to this like spiritual way of being. And I really like that. So it really kind of brings that in. The fifth house is such a cool house because it's, it's a way of extending your sense of self. It's where you really create. In essence, you're creating yourself here. This is where you get that opportunity to try different, like you said, like risky ventures and try them and see how that fits and go for it. And not worry about it if it isn't the right thing. So, and then at the same time, having Saturn moving in here is like bringing this element of like, don't take any risks, hold on. And so the two together is sort of saying, take the right risk, take the right risk of like selflessness, take the right risk of knowing yourself deeply, seeing your vulnerabilities, and then saying, no, I'm gonna, this is where I'm gonna really fully give of myself, and I'm gonna do it with a gravitas, with an authority that's new. That's what Saturn's representing as it comes in there. So I like that.
it also
Um,
it
that
makes me
way.
think as you were talking, it's like Neptune going into that fifth house could really, yeah, really elevate, especially your creativity around art. It could
Yeah,
really just bring so much, um, could bring a lot of really great stuff in there as Saturn
yeah,
structures it ultimately.
yeah.
That's
Especially when you
lovely.
factor in, the idea we've been kind of factoring in here of like the fact that Pluto moved into Aquarius a
Right.
couple of years ago, and in these charts, it's very supportive. So that brings in your voice. So yes, this idea of communicating, your ability to communicate this transcendent art form. I mean, immediately it takes me to the museum, to my favorite like impressionist paintings, and how uplifted and elevated you feel, and that's from somebody expressing themselves, expressing their true voice, and incorporating that, and it just absolutely uplifts you. So this, I really like the idea of thinking about this in the fifth house. I mean, I think the fifth house is such a fun and interesting house with all of its things that it means. So I like that altogether.
That's
um
awesome. Yeah,
and then you can also like, what's the other, I know we've been bringing in these other things about Saturn in the past.
yeah.
uh,
So you want to look what was going on in terms of your creativity between 1996 and 99. That was the last time Saturn was moving through that area. How did your creativity develop and strengthen during that time? There's some way that there's a reflection of that now. And it's not, you're not at the same level. You're, almost 30 years later, but there is a reflection of what was going on at that time. And it's good to think about that and think about how that relates to now.
yeah, it's helpful. Okay.
I love that. Okay, we're going to move then to folks who have Capricorn rising.
Okay, so if you have Capricorn rising, this Neptune and Saturn moving into Aries is entering your fourth house. Before we see anything else about that, just look at where the fourth house is. I mean, it's at the very bottom of the chart. So it is the most private place in the chart, generally speaking. It's really that root that's buried underneath the soil. So for that reason, you can think of it as like the lineage that you came in with, the ancestry that informed who you are in this present moment. So that's kind of the deeper spiritual level. On less deep level, we're talking about our home. Where do we live? Maybe the connection to the land of where you live, but your home, and then the people in that home, the family that you live with, whoever that is. So it kind of brings in all those layers, and having these two planets move in there, it's somewhat of a juxtaposition because Aries is such a bright, bold sign, like, and then it's moving into this really private place. You know, these two planets are lighting up this really private place. So I think that's interesting, but at the same time, think about how much courage it takes, to face the past, to face the ancestry, to face whatever your ancestors may have done in their lifetime, as part of their culture and so on and so forth. So there's really, or to stand up to your family of origin. Maybe you're really different than your family of origin and you've had to really be brave and like stand up and say, no, I'm not doing it that way. So you start kind of understanding what it might mean for this to be activated. The other layers here is that Neptune is dissolving. And what is it dissolving? It's asking us to dissolve our ego structures around our family of origin. Who we think we are based on who we're from. I'm sorry, where we're from. So there's a real need to look at that piece of it. Like, what are the ego attachments to this? What are some things that I might need to let go of? Like, I really identify with where I come from, and maybe it's time to just cast that to the wind and not worry about it too much and see yourself as a member of the human family on the planet, rather than a specific individual family. I mean, that is definitely part of the meaning. When Saturn comes in there too, it's also saying, okay, and then how can you somewhat reclaim yourself? How can you start on a new path of your own individualism that is setting a new route for you to be different somehow, and then just really looking at the juxtaposition to those things and seeing where you might need to release ego attachments or seeing where you might release some kind of almost like selfishness that's wrapped in here somehow. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, that's some of the themes that we're really looking at. And part of this has been having to deal with vulnerabilities that have come up for you, like recognizing the places where you feel like there's holes in your foundation, like there's potholes in your foundation, and that you've needed to navigate those and develop a greater sense of self-compassion. That is also part of the picture of what you need to be doing with Neptune coming into that, and a process that you've already been a part of. So before I go rattling on, Laurie, do you want to talk about the other kind of piece here
Yeah,
that might be empowering
I,
this?
I do. I also want to just say that, this could be very painful, dissolving this area of your ego attachment to home and family. There could be a lot of pain involved in that. Obviously, it'll be different for everyone, but just, understanding that the supportive side of Saturn will help you rebuild whatever it is that must dissolve, and to understand that whatever dissolves is necessary in order to use the vulnerability underneath that ego to build what is needed there. The other pieces that we wanted to add is the fact that Pluto having relatively recently in the last couple of years moving into the second house, the development of your own sense of self-worth, possibly connected with money or resources as well, but your own increased understanding of your self-worth is really supporting this process of ultimately developing stronger roots. The
Mm-hmm.
other piece is to think back to 1996 to 1999 when Saturn was last moving through your fourth house. During those years, what was the development for you around home and family? There's an echo of that period of time now. What began to develop in your maturing or your efforts to create stability in your home and family at that time is now that cycle is over and you're starting a new process over the next few years to develop more strength in that area after the dissolving part takes place and leaves you naked and vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, I think having this in the fourth house, this is brings in another layer of vulnerability because it's sort of like having to expose the root, and then cover it back over with something different and healthier, more balanced or something. It really is this yeah, an interesting opportunity here, I think.
Yeah.
But like you said, probably could be pretty painful. Yeah. And
Yeah.
also maybe you're just gonna move house.
Right. Maybe you're going to move and you're going to feel lost. I mean that,
Yeah,
you know,
right? Have to build new community or, you
right.
know.
If you move, you can see how that could happen so easily. Pluto moved into Aquarius. You've got, your resources all lined up so that you can afford to move to Italy because you're done here. But then you get there and you feel kind of wiped out. You don't know where you are. You don't know where your roots are, and you have to rebuild them. There's so many ways that these things can play out. But, and
Yeah.
each of our stories is very individual. So we're going to move on to folks who have Aquarius rising. If you've got Aquarius rising, this is bringing these two planets, Saturn and Neptune, into your third house. Now, the third house, it's such an interesting house because it really relates to our neighborhood, our siblings, our neighbors, our cousins, the people in our lives who we didn't choose to be there, but it also refers to how we use our voice because it's within those neighborhood relationships that we develop our voice initially. So that's why those come together in the same place. Now, with you, Aquarius rising, having Aries in that house, there's a tendency to be pretty direct with your voice, to have a certain amount of ego attachment to how you use your voice and how you interact in these particular types of relationships. There may be under the surface, under that ego bravado voice, there may be a lot of vulnerability for you in this area. There likely is, whether you know it or not. You will know it as Neptune moves in there and starts dissolving your ego. There may be a period of time here where you feel kind of lost. How do I use my voice? How do I access my authentic voice? You want to really allow your ego to dissolve and find a more mystical or spiritual connection to your voice. Over the course of the next year or two, you're going to start to rebuild that area after the dissolving. When Saturn gets past Neptune and starts going off on its own, leaving Neptune behind, you'll be able to really get into some of the more work of developing a more authentic voice.
Yeah, and I think too, as an Aquarius rising person, it's like, well, you've got Pisces in the second house. So you have an enormous resource in your ability to work with the mystical and your ability to work with and understand compassion and how you want to share that. I mean, this is a resource, and that is what is that all the things that you've had to learn recently as Saturn and Neptune then move into your third house. It's like you have a lot to say, and you have a powerful, I almost think of it as like an underground pool of water for you to draw on. It's like groundwater for you to draw on, like groundwater that's made up of compassion as you use this your voice. I think there's a lot of leadership capacity you have just in talking to people because you have Aries in the third house. And again, that, yeah, like Laurie's saying, I mean, the Neptune and Saturn, that's that fine line of letting go on one hand of your attachments, and I need to speak a certain way and be a certain way in how I use my voice or with my siblings. Um, but then at the same time, like, being recognizing your individual contribution that Saturn and Aries represents, but letting it be based in that pool of compassion, not on your own need for ambition or accomplishment. So that's kind of, I don't know, but I like this idea of the powerful voice, and I certainly can think of people, Aquarius rising people, who, by the way, are in the processes of an incredible transformation because Aquarius rising people have Pluto in the first house. So your very relationship with yourself is fundamentally being altered. Like there's a flattening and then a metamorphosis that is occurring in the first house. So all of this is this underground process that is transforming you into this voice leader, this person who can really say what needs to be said on behalf of those who cannot speak for themselves. There's something really potent in all of that. I like how thinking about the Pluto there in the first house in support of this. It's a supportive process, not at odds with it. So
Right.
all of this is changing you dramatically, you know.
Yeah.
So,
This,
mhm.
yeah, the empowered sense of self that has been being developed over the last couple of years is really supporting that understanding that you have to dissolve something in how you use your voice in order to rebuild it in a more authentic way. And then the only other piece is to look back, what was going on, what was developing around your understanding of what needs to be said, what you need to say in the world back in 96 to 99. That was the last time Saturn was going through that area. There was some way in which your voice and your connection to those people in your life that you didn't choose, your cousins and neighbors and siblings, there was a way that that area was developing at that time that is a reflection of now, and reflecting on it can really help you to see how your voice needs to develop in a more authentic way now.
Yeah, and even if you're not that old and it brings you back to childhood at this time, there's still really interesting things to think about what was going on in family dynamics and with parents. So I won't add that because I know both of us are a little bit older, so we can think about this in adult terms, but some people can't. You're thinking back to childhood, but nonetheless, very fruitful stuff. I mean, maybe you need to check in with the parents to see what that was about. But anyway, yeah,
Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah,
yeah,
not
hopefully,
everybody's as ancient as I am, or even you.
I know. Yep.
Okay, so let's
Okay.
move on to folks who have Pisces rising.
Okay, so those of you with Pisces rising, first of all, Pisces rising makes a big suggestion about leading your way in the world with a spiritual face or with a compassionate face. That's a lot of what Pisces rising might say.
Or confused.
What?
Sorry. I said or confused.
Okay, yeah, that's right. Yeah, or deluded. But anyway, hopefully it's not you. Um, so anyway, this Neptune and Saturn business of entering Aries, what it's doing is it's going into your second house. And, the second house is not the easiest place. The second house is a place where we have to deal with money. We have to deal with a wealth of resources or a lack of resources or something. There's a real component there that can bring in lots of issues on different levels, and also can be that deep psychological thing of how you value yourself, and I'm just going to be honest, if you're born anything other than, into the kind of standard realm of things, then you've had to question, who you are. Like if you're a woman, or if you're a person of color, or if you are LGBTQ or whatever, if you're different in any way, this is an even more difficult area a lot of times where you've had to face things. So when these planets move into this area, this is actually some of what's going to be brought up, because I think the second house still kind of deals with your identity in a certain way. It's so close to the first house of self that you're still trying to figure things out here. So with these planets moving there, there's going to be this real need to take a look at that and look at places of ego attachment. Like if you're a person of a lot of means, it could easily be an ego attachment here, like, oh, I'm good, I'm wealthy, I'm fine, and not so. With Neptune here, there's a dissolution of anything that you might be thinking, or even your attachments to, oh, I don't have many means. Well, there's more resources than just financial. So no matter what, there is a dissolving that is happening of whatever it is that you identify with as being your sense of self here. And then Saturn coming in to the mix is really demanding that you really look at that and take responsibility for, whatever the issue is here, and let yourself release the attachment to ego so that you can build something new once Saturn really gets going here. So I think this one might be it could be pretty difficult on a lot of levels. There's a lot of things about worth that can be very painful and somewhat excruciating. But ultimately, what is being done here is it's linking your personal self-worth to the collective, letting you see that you're part of this collective interconnectedness, that you're part of a big old team ultimately, and then at the same moment being able to step into a new version of that, and a new way of wielding your authority that isn't based on, these more artificial things, but is actually based on the notion of interconnectedness and based on more spiritual components rather than just tangible. So there's something all in that mix. And, you've been through it. I mean, with Saturn going through your first house and Pisces all that time, like you've had to learn some lessons about self compassion. And then now you're being asked to how do you bring that forwards and apply anything you've learned, any vulnerability to be a resource and to allow you to be more resilient. So I think that is part of what's going on here. And you may also want to just think back 30 years ago when Saturn was in Aries the last time. It was happened in 1996 through 99. And I'm bringing this up because it might shed light on whatever this process is for you now. Because 30 years ago, you had the same thing happen with Saturn coming here, but you were younger and you were somewhat of a different person. So look at that story and ask yourself what it is telling you about yourself that can help you see your path forward here. Yeah.
I, as you're talking, I'm thinking about those planets moving into the second house. I'm thinking about cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Thinking about, the second house, if we think of it as money and resources, yeah, there's some way that your ego is attached to the fact that maybe you have money, like you said, Jenny, or maybe your ego is attached to the fact that you don't have any, whatever it is. But there's some way in which those ideas of resources and what you believe around resources is being dismantled, is dissolving. Yeah, it could be a very painful time. And yet, understanding that on the other side, as Saturn gets past Neptune and starts, moving out on its own, you're going to be in a process of rebuilding. So, yeah, there's a lot to look at in there. There's a
Mhm.
lot to look at in there. And the other piece that we wanted to mention is with Pluto having still in the very, very early degrees of Aquarius, it is really supporting you in the building process of this. And that Pluto is in your 12th house. So there's some real internal process that has been really changing over the last few years. Some psychological understanding or spiritual understanding that you've been developing that is really helping you along the way of understanding what your self-worth is, how it's connected to money and resources, what needs to dissolve in order for your ego to kind of break down, look at your own vulnerability here, and then rebuild.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some, the word obliteration is kind of coming to mind for me on this one, in the sense that Pluto's going through your 12th house. So it's kind of obliterating any disillusion, or I'm sorry, illusion about you as a separate self, and so what that is allowing you to do is to kind of harness your own energy on behalf of, collective forces. I mean, that's allowing you to do that as a support for that. So it's not an easy line to walk, because you're not completely losing yourself into this process, but there is a need to surrender the self somehow to these much greater forces, yet still see that individual thread that you have to offer, that you to weave the greater fabric of the collective. So it's a very it's a fine line, but it's also just, really lines up with the truth of life, is that things are both independent and interconnected at the same moment. So yeah.
Fascinating.
Okay.
Fascinating. I think we have completed. I think we've completed. So, anything you want to say as a wrap up here?
Well, no, I not really. Just thanks for watching. Thanks for checking us out. thanks for contributing your comments and so on. So thank you.
I think, there is difficulty ahead. And on the other side, these are just part of the big cycles that humanity goes through. And we're just in the middle of this specific period of time.
Yes.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Great. Bye.